Welcome to Animal Cognition, Lecture 5, Part 1. Today we're going to begin our discussion of whether animals have higher level cognitive abilities. And in doing so, we're going to be discussing Wolfgang Köhler's research on chimpanzees and whether they have the ability to engage in insightful problem solving. And then we're going to turn to a discussion of whether animals can understand causal relations when they're solving problems. And in this regard, we're going to be discussing some research on what's called the trap tube problem. In this part, we're going to be discussing primate research on that problem, and then next time we're going to discuss other species as well. So, the overall question that we're addressing is whether animals have higher level cognitive abilities. So far in this course, we've seen that many animals have instincts, and that sometimes these instincts allow them to engage in very complex behaviors. We saw, for example, that digger wasps build these highly structured nests for their larvae. And although these structures are very complex, the processes that underlie them are these thoughtless subroutines, right? Not some complex cognitive ability. And we also discussed classical and operant conditioning, and that these can produce complex behavior. Operant conditioning, for example, through shaping of successive approximations, can produce complex behavior, even though no one thinks that complex cognitive abilities on the part of animals are involved. What looks complex can actually be the result of very simple learning mechanisms. And also when we discuss classical conditioning, we saw that there is a cognitive dimension to classical conditioning, but that doesn't mean that there's higher level cognitive abilities involved either. So when I'm talking about higher level cognitive abilities, I'm talking about the kinds of things that would be involved when an animal is solving a problem. Right? So can animals solve a problem by gaining an understanding into the nature of the problem? And can they think about a possible solution to that problem? And when discussing problem solving in animals, we have to keep in mind Morgan's canon. Right? Can we explain the behavior involved in problem solving by appealing to these lower level processes? Or do we have to attribute to the animal some kind of higher level problem solving abilities? So many studies, especially the classic studies on problem solving in animals, claim to demonstrate these abilities to engage in thoughtful problem solving. But in fact, they can be interpreted in more deflationary ways, so by appealing to lower level learning processes. So when the researchers were first examining problem solving, they were interested in whether animals can do so with insight into a problem. Right? So if an animal has insight into a problem, they understand the problem and they figure out by using thought, right, how to go about solving it. Right? Solving a problem involves going from an initial state where the animal first finds itself confronted with the problem to a goal state where the problem is solved. Right? So problem solving involves going from an initial state to a goal state through some kind of thoughtful process. And insight requires an animal to understand the causal relations. They understand how to go from the initial state to the goal state and the causal processes that would lead to that. So for example, they have to understand that by shaping an object in a particular way, they'd be able to get the object that it desires. So for example, if a piece of food is stuck inside of a hole, they might have to understand that by shaping a piece of wire, by bending a piece of wire, they can use it as a hook that they can then fish out the food. Right? That would be a case of insightful problem solving. And importantly, the solution has to be arrived at by thought in order for it to count as insight. and they can't just stumble upon a solution by trial and error. So as I said, I want to start with some of the classic research on problem solving in animals. And in particular, I want to discuss Wolfgang Köhler's research. Right? Wolfgang Köhler is the famous Gestalt psychologist, and he was sequestered on the Canary Islands during the First World War. So he decided while he was there that he would study some of the chimpanzees that were present in the zoo in the Canary Islands. And he presented his chimpanzees some problems that he thought would require insight to solve. And then he observed how they went about solving them. So one of the problems that he presented the chimpanzees was what's called the block stacking task. And in this problem, for example, a banana was hung from the top of a roof from a rope, but it was out of reach, so the chimpanzees couldn't just reach up and get it. And also in the enclosure, several boxes were placed around, and the boxes had different sizes. And so that would be the initial state of the problem, right? Banana hanging from the ceiling, bunch of boxes lying around. That's the initial state. So the goal state is actually being able to reach that banana. So one of the chimpanzees was named Sultan, and this is Köhler's description of Sultan attacking the problem. He says, the objective hangs still higher up. Sultan has fasted all the forenoon and therefore goes at his task with great zeal. He lays the heavy box flat underneath the objective, puts the second one upright upon it, and standing on the top tries to seize the objective. As he doesn't reach it, he looks down and round about, and his glance is caught by the third box, which may have seemed useless to him at first because of its smallness. He climbs down very carefully, seizes the box, climbs up with it, and completes the construction. So you can see this is some pictures that Köhler took while the chimpanzees are solving the problem. I love the ones that are sitting around cheering Sultan solving the problem. So you can see him staring at the banana and grabbing the box and then putting it underneath. Now, throughout his research, what Köhler emphasized was the suddenness with which the solutions were discovered. Right, so the chimpanzee goes from a period of just staring at the problem, and then he doesn't just stumble upon it. It's all of a sudden he seems to know what to do. Right? Why is this important? Because it suggests insight. And insight involves this aha experience, right, where you suddenly know how to solve the problem. Now, one of the limitations of this research is the fact that it was uncontrolled. Right? We know very little about the chimps' prior training or experiences that they've had. Right? So, for example, Köhler admits that the chimps had previous opportunities to play with the materials, and more importantly, the chimps could have also observed others stacking boxes, right, to reach objects. Right, so we don't know that. We don't know whether or not that happened. And so rather than having figured it out, they may have simply remembered someone doing something similar. We also know that there was people around watching the chimpanzees, and we don't know whether these people cued the animals in any way. So that's why we can't draw any strong conclusions from Köhler's research. Right? It's plagued by a lack of controls, and also the whole notion of insight is rather vague. Right? It's this subjective experience of this suddenly understanding the problem. Well, how do you study that from the outside as an observer? So that's why modern research into problem solving tries to focus more specifically on an aspect of problem solving. Right? More in particular, modern researchers try to know or study what animals know about causal relations that might be important in solving a problem. And one of the lessons of this research is that many animals don't seem to be very good at reasoning about causal relations between physical objects. Right? Even the apes that were studied by Curler don't seem to be very good at stacking the boxes. Right? Now we're going to see that there are some exceptions to this ability to understand causal relations, but even stacking boxes, right, seems like something that they could be better at. So look at how Sultan, for example, stacked the boxes. Would you stack the boxes in this way? Probably not, right? Because they're very likely to fall, right? So he knows that you got to put one on top of the other, but he doesn't understand all the physical causal affordances of these boxes, right? They should be placed firmly on top of each other, not like this where they're likely to fall. So as I said at the beginning, one problem that's been used to study causal understanding is the trap tube problem. And one of the benefits of this problem is that it can be tailored to lots of different species. Right? Lots of different kinds of primates, for example, have been studied with it, and also some avian species, right? Birds. So this is good because it allows you to compare the cognitive abilities of many different kinds of animals. So the way that this problem works is that there's a glass tube that's placed in an enclosure that the animal can see, and they're also given a tool for being able to push out or pull out some food that's placed inside the tube. Now also important is the fact that the tube contains a trap, hence a trap tube problem. So you can see on the right here, if the animal pushes the food from the right to the left, he's going to fail to get the food because the food's going to fall in the trap. Success on this problem requires that the animal push the food from the other side out the hole on the other end. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies. The first one is by Wieselbergi and her colleague. They studied capuchin monkeys using the trap tube, and they found that only 1 out of 4 seemed to figure it out. Okay, so only 1 out of 4 was able to figure out how to get the food out. But even the one that was successful didn't seem to really understand the problem or approach it in the way that we would. Right? So what they conclude is that the capuchin monkeys seem to be using a heuristic, a rule of thumb for approaching the problem that we wouldn't use. So what is this heuristic? What is this rule of thumb? Basically, insert the stick in the end furthest from the peanut and then push. Okay, so let's go back to see what that looks like. Insert the stick from the end furthest from the food and then push. You could see that that would work on the bottom, right? In this one, inserting from the left, that's the farthest end from the food, and then you push, that would lead to success. If you push from the end closest to the food, you're going to fail. So the fact that the monkeys were using this heuristic is shown by the fact that they used it when it didn't work. Right, so using the strategy of pushing from the end closest or farthest from the food would work in conditions A and C listed in this figure. Right, so they put the trap in different positions along the tube, and then they tested what would happen. So if you push from the end furthest from the food, that would work in A, and it would also work in C. But it would not work in the case of B and D, right? Because then the food would fall into the trap. And that's in fact what happened, right? The ones that were able to solve the problem initially failed when confronted with problems B and D. Now we wouldn't be fooled by this, right? Because we understand the causal relations. So it's clear that they're not understanding it, they're simply using a heuristic. So So the monkey didn't have a good understanding of the problem, or that objects can't move across a surface that has a hole in it, right? So another way of saying this is that they don't have insight into the nature of the problem as far as the causal relations are involved. Well, you might think, well, capuchin monkeys are very different from us. Phylogenetically, they're a very different species. What about our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees? Pavanelli also studied this. He gave the trap tube problem to chimpanzees. And here, only 2 out of 5 solved the problem. And again, they didn't seem to understand the causal structure of the task. They also seem to be relying on this same heuristic of inserting the food from the end farthest, or inserting the stick from the end farthest from the food. So how does he know that? Because they continued to do this even when it wasn't relevant. Right. So if you look at this figure here, you can see that the difference here is that the trap now is, so that the trap tube is inverted, so that the trap is on the top. And the monkey starts off, the chimpanzee starts off on the other side. But rather than pushing from the end that he's closest to, he goes to the other side and pushes the stick from the end farthest from the food, even though it's completely unnecessary. Right? In a sense, it doesn't matter which side you choose, but they still prefer to go to the end farthest from the food. So the behavior of the primates that have been studied suggests that they solve the physics problem using some associations that they've learned, right? Some heuristics, some rules of thumb that can solve the problem in many cases, but fail in others that wouldn't fool us. So they don't seem to understand the causally relevant properties of physical objects. So why is that a problem? Because by relying on these heuristics, it makes their behavior very rigid and not responsive to novelties in the situation. Right? So it doesn't allow for flexibility when they confront problems. So having an insight, having an understanding of the causal structure of the problem would allow them to be more flexible. And that seems to be at least human strength. And we'll pick up this discussion in the second part.